So, welcome to this first video in the unit preparing you for your internal assessment. Now, in this first video, we're going to be looking at what is the scientific method. So, hopefully, you'll be able to state the different parts of the scientific method, be able to describe how it works, how it proceeds, what are the different parts. And hopefully you can explain why science is a continuous phenomenon, how it never really ends. So throughout your studies, you should get used to referencing. Now we use the Harvard referencing system, and we're going to have a video specifically on this later on in the course. For now, you should be getting used to how to reference different sources. So for this video, I've used a textbook and I've used two websites. So hopefully you'll notice the citations throughout the presentation. Okay, let's start with what is science. So this whole lecture is more theoretical. We will have videos on the specific parts of the internal assessment, how to get your marks, etc. But we're going to start with a more theoretical outlook. So I just want you to pause for a second. I want you to think about, what do you think of as science? Well, if we just get a dictionary definition, such as this one, it's quite wordy. Let's break it down into specific parts. What do we have? Okay, so intellectual and practical activity. So it's both theoretical, but it's also practical. Systematic study, it's done in a certain way. And it's looking at the natural and physical world. So you could think of science as a way of trying to interpret what is around us. And it's done through observation and experimentation. So these are all key points of what science is. Regardless of the definition, you don't have to learn a word-by-word definition, that is pointless, but you should be aware of the different parts which make science what it is. Now, whilst many of the videos in this unit are applicable for the Group 4 subjects, I'm mostly making these for my chemistry students. So, what is chemistry within science? So chemistry is all about atoms, its electrons, how they interact, and how that translates to the macroscopic level. Basically, what we can see, touch, experience. Now, Alex Johnston, back in the 90s, came up with what has been called Johnston's triangle. And this looks at the three different sort of areas of chemistry. So we have the macroscopic, which is what I've just mentioned. It's what we can see and touch. So for instance, laboratory experiments. We have the microscopic or submicroscopic, and that is what is happening at a level lower than what we can see. So quite often we create models to represent what we think is happening. Think particle level diagrams. Okay. And the third one is the symbolic. There is maths in your chemistry studies. Even chemical formulae are a way that humans are just representing a scientific concept. So symbolic. But an important point underlying all three corners of this triangle is that it's all based on experimentation. Obviously the macroscopic is the actual doing the experiments, but without these experiments we cannot develop theories at the microscopic level, and the symbolic part of the triangle is normally based on experimental evidence. So experimentation is very important. So if you're wanting to develop as a scientist, you need to be able to correctly design and implement a scientific investigation. Now, where does this link into your IB studies? The internal assessment. So yes, you'll be doing experiments throughout the course to help with your learning, and that's very important. But remember, your internal assessment is worth 20% of your chemistry grade. So it is very important to be able to do it properly. Now, these videos are going to look at each part and should be able to help you design and implement your experiment for your internal assessment. So, before we get into the bits and pieces, let's think about what the scientific method actually is. So a simple way of thinking about science is trying to find a link between observation and theory. We've already mentioned observations of the natural world around us. And science is a way of trying to bridge the gap between what you observe and how it works, the theory of how it works. Now, there are a number of different explanations to what the scientific method is, but they generally contain the same parts, even if they're not identical. Generally, it's accepted that science is about organizing observations of the world around us, and it has to be done in a rigorous and systematic way. Now, it often uses experimentation, where you look at one factor at a time and eliminate everything else. You then gather data, make conclusions, get results. Now, these can be used to either support or oppose a theory. And then over time, if a theory isn't disproved or doesn't have too much opposition, and there are lots of experiments done to try and disprove it, but if they fail, then over time this conclusion is taken as a sort of general rule for how things work. So let's try and link this into the experimental method. So generally, a scientific experiment starts with some sort of theory or idea. Now, this could be something already determined, or it could just be something you're interested in and want to experiment on it. Now, from this, you need to develop a research question and then look at specific hypotheses. You then design an experiment to test your hypothesis. You gather data. You analyze this data. And from this, you draw your conclusions. So this can be thought of as empirical knowledge. You're having to see it and experience it for yourself. That's why we design and complete these experiments. Now, the experimental method that we see here closely links itself to the overall scientific method. So if we think of it as a cycle, you go through all these steps, but your conclusions then link back to the original theory. Either it's supporting a theory or it's opposing it. Now, science can be described as self-correcting, because one of the good things about science is that the whole point of this experimental procedure is that it should be able to be reproduced by other scientists. And if they can get the same results using the same experiment, then it starts to prove the validity of your results. Likewise, if scientists cannot replicate your results, then that puts serious doubt on your conclusions and on your experiment as a whole. So over time, theories which aren't really supported by the evidence should be identified and highlighted as not being correct. It also means that once a theory has been proposed, that this can be improved upon. We can have a certain understanding of a concept, but based on that theory, new experiments can be designed, and that can lead to slightly improved conclusions, a slightly improved theory. So science as a whole is one big cycle, and it can be argued that it can never be over. Just as it can also be argued that it can't actually prove anything because it's an ongoing process. Okay, so that was just a very quick introduction to this unit. Hopefully, you can now state the different parts of the scientific method, be able to describe how they all link in together. And hopefully you can explain how the scientific method is one continuous loop. So thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.